The bridge had no name anymore. If it ever had one, the records were lost, buried in some municipal archive that no one bothered to search. It stood at the edge of Millbrook, where the town gave way to forest, and the Clearwater River ran deep and quiet beneath willow trees that trailed their branches in the current. Most people had forgotten it existed. The new highway bypass had been built 20 years ago, carrying traffic miles to the east. The old road that once crossed the bridge now ended abruptly at a weathered barricade, overtaken by grass and wildflowers. But the bridge remained, its stone arches still sound, its surface still solid beneath the moss and fallen leaves. Maya Okonkwo discovered it on a Tuesday in late September. She was a cartographer by training and by temperament, someone who found comfort in the precise lines of maps, in the satisfaction of translating three-dimensional space onto flat paper. She had spent 15 years working for a mapping company in Portland, creating GPS overlays and digital representations of changing landscapes. But the work had become, gradually and then suddenly, unbearable. Every map was now just data points and algorithms. The art had been stripped away, leaving only efficiency. So Maya had quit, packed her few belongings, bought a small cottage on the outskirts of Millbrook, and decided to spend a year making maps the old way, walking the land, drawing what she saw, recording the stories that lived in places. She had been following the Clearwater River upstream, sketching its curves and noting the places where tributaries fed into it. When she pushed through a thick stand of willows and found the bridge, it took her breath away. The bridge was beautiful in the way that forgotten things often are, graceful despite neglect, dignified in its abandonment. 3 stone arches spanned the river, their keystones carved with worn designs that might have been flowers or stars or abstract patterns. Ivy climbed the supports, and moss covered much of the stonework in shades of green and gold. Beneath the central arch, the water ran deep and dark, reflecting the overhanging trees. Maya stood at the entrance to the bridge, her sketchbook in hand, and felt something shift inside her. This place was important somehow. It held something, not just physical space, but meaning, memory, accumulated significance. She spent the rest of the day there, drawing the bridge from every angle, noting the way light moved across the stone, the sound of water flowing beneath the arches, the particular quality of silence that hung in the air. As evening approached and the light began to fade, she finally crossed to the far side and discovered something unexpected. There was a wooden box, weathered but still intact, tucked into a niche where the bridge met the bank. Inside the box were notebooks, dozens of them, in various states of decay. And on the first page of the topmost notebook, written in careful script, was a title, Stories Carried by Flowing Water, The Bridge Chronicles. Maya opened the notebook carefully. The pages were brittle, yellow with age, but the ink was still legible. The first entry was dated April 3rd, 1962. My name is Robert Chun, and I am 67 years old. I have lived in Millbrook my entire life, and I have crossed this bridge thousands of times. But it was only today, sitting beneath the central arch and watching the water flow past, that I understood what this bridge really is. It is a threshold, a place between places. The water that flows beneath it carries stories, memories, dreams, regrets, hopes, downstream from all the lives it has touched upstream. And if you sit here long enough, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear them. I am going to write them down. All the stories I hear, all the lives the river whispers about. I don't know how long I'll be able to continue this work. My hands shake more each year and my eyesight dims. But I will record what I can for as long as I can. Someone, someday, should know that these lives mattered, that these stories existed. Maya read Robert Chen's entries as the last light faded from the sky. He had written about people who had crossed the bridge or sat beneath it or thrown things into the river. He wrote about a young woman who had stood on the bridge in a rainstorm and decided not to jump, a father who had brought his daughters to fish from the banks and taught them patience, a pair of lovers who had carved their initials into the stone and then, years later, returned to show their grandchildren. The entries continued for years, gradually becoming shakier, harder to read. The final entry was dated June 15th, 1969. My hands can no longer hold the pen steadily. My eyes can barely make out what I write. This will be my last entry. But the stories don't stop. They never stop. The river keeps flowing, keeps carrying the weight of all these lives downstream. I hope someone finds these notebooks. I hope someone continues the work. Listen to the water. It has so much to tell. Maya sat beneath the bridge as darkness fell completely, the notebooks in her lap, and listened. At first, she heard only the obvious sounds, the gurgle and splash of water over stones, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the distant call of an owl. But gradually, as she let herself relax into the listening, she began to hear something else. Not voices exactly, but something like them, impressions, echoes of emotion carried by the flowing water. She felt suddenly that she had been brought here for a reason, that her decision to quit her job, to move to Millbrook, to follow the river upstream, all of it had been leading to this moment, this discovery, this inheritance. Maya Okonkwo, cartographer of physical spaces, will become the keeper of these story maps. She would sit beneath this bridge and listen to what the water had to say. She would record the stories that needed telling. She would continue Robert Chen's work. She gathered the notebooks carefully and carried them back to her cottage. That night, she read them all, working through the hours until dawn broke over the eastern hills. And as the sun rose, she made herself coffee, took out a new notebook, one with heavy archival quality paper that would last for decades, and wrote on the first page, "The Bridge Chronicles continued. September 24th, 2025. Maya Okonkwo, keeper." Then she returned to the bridge. Maya established a routine. Each morning, she would walk to the bridge with her notebook, a thermos of coffee, and a weatherproof cushion to sit on. She would settle herself beneath the central arch, where the acoustics seemed to amplify the sound of flowing water, and she would listen. The first story came to her on her third day as keeper. She was sitting with her eyes closed, notebook open on her lap, when she felt it, a sharp pang of loneliness, not her own but carried by the water from somewhere upstream. She opened her eyes and saw a young man standing on the bridge. He couldn't have been more than 25, dressed in work clothes, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, looking down at the water before he finally sighed, turned, and walked back the way he'd come. Maya wrote, October 1st, 2025. A young man, carrying the weight of isolation. He works in the city, commutes 2 hours each way, lives alone in an apartment where the walls are thin enough to hear his neighbors' lives, but not thin enough to feel part of them. He came to the bridge because his grandmother told him about it once, told him it was a place where people came to think. He's thinking about whether to stay in Millbrook or accept a job offer in Seattle. He's thinking that either way, he'll still be alone. He doesn't know yet that loneliness is a kind of bridge, too, connecting him to every other person who has ever felt this way. She didn't know how she knew these things. They simply came to her as she sat there, as she listened to the water and watched the young man walk away. It was as if the river had absorbed his presence, his emotional state, and carried the information to her. Over the following weeks, more stories came. There was an elderly woman who walked the bridge every Tuesday afternoon, carrying bread crusts to feed the fish. Maya learned somehow that the woman's husband had proposed to her on this bridge in 1958, that they had been married for 47 years before his death, that she came here to feel close to him still. There was a girl, perhaps 12 years old, who sat on the bank and cried for reasons she probably couldn't have articulated herself. Maya understood that the girl was in the painful transition between childhood and adolescence, that she felt like she no longer fit anywhere, that she came to the river because water, at least, was always changing, and so maybe she was allowed to change too. There was a man in his 40s who came to the bridge in the middle of the night, drunk and stumbling, and who stood swaying at its center for half an hour before weaving his way home. Maya wrote about the business he'd lost, the marriage that had failed, the son who wouldn't speak to him. She wrote about the moment he almost jumped and the moment he decided not to, and how those two moments would define the rest of his life. Maya recorded them all. She tried to write without judgment, to simply bear witness to these lives and their complexity, and their pain, and their occasional joy. She began to understand what Robert Chin had meant about the river carrying stories. The water was a kind of collective memory, absorbing the emotional residue of everyone who came near it, carrying it downstream, offering it to anyone willing to listen. Sometimes people noticed her beneath the bridge. A few asked what she was doing. She told him she was writing about the river, about the bridge, about the town. Most nodded and left her alone. A few sat with her for a while, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes they would start talking, and Maya would realize that they needed to tell their stories to an actual person, not just to the water. There was Thomas, who had been a soldier in Iraq, and who came to the bridge when the memories were too loud. He told Maya about the friends he'd lost, about the guilt of survival, about how the sound of flowing water was one of the few things that helped quiet his mind. Maya listened and wrote, and when Thomas finally stood to leave, he thanked her for hearing him. There was Patricia, who had recently moved to Millbrook to care for her aging mother. She talked about the difficulty of watching someone you love forget who they are, about the exhaustion of caregiving, about the resentment she felt and then felt guilty for feeling. Maya wrote it all down and told Patricia that resentment and love could exist together, that she didn't have to feel guilty for being human. There was David, who had recently come out as gay at age 53 and was navigating the strange terrain of dating for the first time as his authentic self. He laughed as he talked about his awkward attempts at using dating apps, but Maya could hear the fear beneath the laughter. Fear that he'd waited too long, that he wasted the best years of his life, that he'd never find what he was looking for. Maya wrote all their stories. She wrote about the young mother who brought her colicky baby to the bridge at 3 a.m. because the sound of water seemed to soothe him. She wrote about the artist who came to sketch the bridge and ended up sketching the people who crossed it instead. She wrote about the teenagers who dared each other to jump from the bridge into the deep pool beneath, a rite of passage that had been going on for generations, apparently, though the adults preferred not to know about it. The notebooks filled quickly. Maya bought more, filling the wooden box that Robert Chun had left behind. She began to see patterns in the stories, themes that repeated across different lives, different generations. The bridge was a place of thresholds, of decisions, of transformations. People came here when they needed to cross from one version of themselves to another, and Maya found that in recording these stories, in bearing witness to these lives, she was undergoing her own transformation. The precise, rigid thinking that had made her a good cartographer was softening. She was learning to map not just physical space, but emotional territory, the hidden geography of human hearts. Winter came, and still she sat beneath the bridge. She brought warmer clothes, a better cushion, a thermos of hot soup instead of coffee. The river slowed but never froze, and the stories kept coming. Fewer people visited the bridge in winter, but those who did seemed to need it more urgently, and their stories cut deeper. There was a woman who came on Christmas Eve, alone, and stood on the bridge weeping for the family she'd lost in a car accident 3 years prior. Maya sat beneath the arch and wept with her, and wrote about grief that doesn't diminish with time, but simply becomes part of you, a weight you learn to carry. There was the man who came on New Year's Day and threw a bottle into the river. Maya learned that it contained a letter to his younger self, full of advice he wished he'd had, full of forgiveness for mistakes he'd made. She wrote about the human need to revise our own histories, to make peace with the people we used to be. As winter turned to spring, Maya realized she had been keeping the Bridge Chronicles for 6 months. She had filled 8 notebooks with stories, and she had barely begun to capture the depth and breadth of lives that touched this place. On a morning in early April, Maya arrived at the bridge to find someone already there. A woman sat beneath the central arch, in the exact spot where Maya usually positioned herself. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a braid, and she was reading one of the notebooks from Robert Chen's collection. Maya froze, unsure what to do. The notebooks were meant to be private, weren't they? Or were they? Robert had left them in a box where anyone could find them. Maybe he had wanted them to be read. The woman looked up and smiled. "You must be Maya," she said. "The new keeper." Maya approached cautiously. "How did you know my name?" "Your name is in the newer notebooks." "I'm Sarah." The woman stood and offered her hand. "Robert Chin was my father." Maya shook her hand, stunned. "Your father? I've been reading his entries for months. I didn't know if he had family, if anyone knew about this work." Sarah gestured for Maya to sit beside her. "He kept it secret from most people, but he told me before he died. Made me promise to check on the bridge periodically, to make sure someone was continuing the work." Her eyes glistened. "I've been coming here every few months for 56 years. You're the first person I found." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "My father believed that stories need to be witnessed, that human lives need to be acknowledged. He thought that was almost a sacred duty, to see people, truly see them, and to record that they existed and mattered." "I'm beginning to understand that," Maya said softly. Sarah picked up one of the newer notebooks, one of Maya's. "May I?" Maya nodded, and Sarah read for a long time. When she finally closed the notebook, she was crying. "You've got it," she said. "You understand what this place is, what this work is." She reached out and squeezed Maya's hand. "Thank you for continuing it. Thank you for listening to what the river has to say." After Sarah left, Maya sat alone beneath the bridge and thought about legacy, about how the work we do ripples forward through time in ways we can't predict or control. Robert Chin had never known that his daughter would guard his work for half a century. He'd never known that a cartographer named Maya would find his notebooks and take up his calling. But the work had continued anyway, passed from hand to hand like a torch in darkness. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A woman came to the bridge, middle-aged, expensively dressed, walking with the careful steps of someone barely holding themselves together. She stood at the center of the bridge for a long time, looking down at the water. Maya watched from beneath the arch, notebook ready, expecting to write another story of contemplation or decision or near disaster averted. But instead, the woman called down to her, "Are you the one who writes the stories?" Maya hesitated, then answered, "Yes." The woman descended the bank and approached Maya with strange, intense energy. "I need you to write mine," she said. "I need someone to know what happened. I need it to be recorded somewhere." Maya gestured to the space beside her. "Sit. Tell me." The woman's name was Jennifer. She had been a high-powered attorney in Boston, working 100-hour weeks, climbing the partnership ladder, living a life that was supposed to bring fulfillment and success. But 3 months ago, she'd had a breakdown. Complete, total collapse. She'd been hospitalized, medicated, sent home to rest. She'd come to Millbrook because her sister lived here, because she needed somewhere quiet to figure out what came next. "I feel like I've wasted my entire life," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "I'm 46 years old, and I have nothing. No family, no real friends, no hobbies, no idea who I even am outside of my work. I built this perfect, impressive life, and it's completely empty." Maya listened and wrote, and when Jennifer paused, Maya said gently, "You know, the river doesn't care about your resume. It doesn't care about your accomplishments or your failures. It just flows. It accepts everything that enters it and carries it forward. Maybe that's what you need to learn, how to just flow for a while, without judging yourself for where you've been or where you're going." Jennifer looked at her with something like wonder. "Is that what the river told you?" "The river tells us what we need to hear," Maya said. Jennifer came back the next day and the next. She would sit with Maya beneath the bridge for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the water. Maya wrote her story in installments, watching as Jennifer slowly began to soften, to release some of the rigid control that had been choking the life out of her. On Jennifer's 5th visit, she brought someone with her, a man named Marcus, who Jennifer introduced as her sister's neighbor. Marcus was a musician who had been struggling with depression for years. Jennifer had told him about the bridge, about Maya, about the strange healing that seemed to happen here. "I don't know if I believe in this," Marcus said, settling onto the bank, "but I'm willing to try anything." Maya smiled. "You don't have to believe in it. Just sit, listen. Tell me your story if you want to, or don't. The river doesn't require belief. It just requires presence." Marcus sat and listened, and slowly, hesitantly, began to talk about the music he'd stopped making, the dreams he'd abandoned, the darkness that had settled over his life like a heavy blanket. Maya wrote it down, and Jennifer sat beside him, and the water flowed past them all, carrying their words downstream. Word spread. Somehow, though Maya never advertised what she was doing, people began coming to the bridge specifically to have their stories recorded. They would sit with Maya, tell her their lives, and she would write it all down with care and attention and compassion. She never promised healing or solutions. She only offered witness. But something did seem to heal anyway. People who came to the bridge carrying heavy burdens often left lighter, not because their problems were solved, but because they'd been seen, they'd been heard. Their stories had been deemed worthy of recording, of remembering, of matching. Maya began to understand that this was the true power of the bridge and the river. Not that they solved anything, but that they provided a space where people could be fully themselves, where their stories could be told without judgment or solution or advice. Just pure, compassionate witnessing. She wrote about the recovering addict who came to the bridge every morning to mark another day of sobriety. She wrote about the immigrant who came to remember the river in his homeland and to mourn the family he'd left behind. She wrote about the child who came with questions about death after losing a grandparent, and how the river's endless flow seemed to help him understand that life continues even as individual lives end. The bridge became a kind of informal community center, though no one planned it that way. People would come expecting to be alone with their thoughts and find others there, and somehow it never felt like an intrusion. They would nod to each other, share the space, occasionally share their stories with each other instead of just with Maya. One evening in late spring, Maya looked up from her notebook to find a dozen people at the bridge, some sitting beneath the arches, some standing on the span above, some on the banks. They weren't talking to each other, weren't interacting really. They were just being present in the same space, each with their own story, each listening to the water in their own way. She thought about Robert Chun, sitting here 60 years ago, first discovering the bridge's power. She thought about all the people whose stories he recorded, whose lives he'd witnessed. She thought about the invisible threads connecting all of them across time. Every person who had ever paused on this bridge, looked down at the flowing water, and felt their burden shift, if only slightly. Maya closed her notebook and simply sat listening. The water sang its endless song. The willow branches swayed overhead. The bridge stood firm, as it had for 100 years and would for 100 more. And beneath it all, the river flowed, carrying stories downstream, carrying sorrows out to sea, bringing new water, new stories, new possibilities with every passing moment. As summer approached, Maya had an idea. She talked to Sarah, Robert Chen's daughter, about it first. Then she talked to some of the regular bridge visitors. The idea grew, developed, took on a life of its own. They would hold a festival at the bridge, a celebration of stories, of the river, of the community that had formed organically around this forgotten place. It would be held on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, and it would run from sunset to sunrise. People would bring lanterns to light the bridge. They would share food, music, and most importantly, stories. Maya made posters and put them up around town. She wasn't sure anyone would come. After all, the bridge was still off the beaten path, still technically forgotten by most of Millbrook. But she felt compelled to try, to honor Robert Chen's legacy and all the lives that had been witnessed here. The summer solstice arrived warm and clear. Maya spent the day preparing, stringing lights along the bridge railings, setting up tables on the bank, arranging cushions beneath the arches. Sarah arrived early to help, bringing her children and grandchildren, 3 generations of Robert Chen's descendants who had never seen the bridge that had meant so much to their patriarch. As sunset approached, Maya stood at the center of the bridge and looked downstream, wondering if anyone would come. They came, first in ones and twos, then in groups, then in what seemed like a steady stream. Some were people Maya knew from the bridge, Jennifer and Marcus and Thomas and Patricia and David, and dozens of others whose stories she'd recorded. But many were strangers, people who had seen the posters or heard about the festival from friends. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, there were more than 100 people gathered at the bridge. They brought blankets and folding chairs, food and drink, instruments and cameras. Children ran along the bank, laughing. Teenagers sat with their feet in the water. Elderly couples held hands and watched the light fade. Maya had prepared a short speech, but when the moment came to give it, she found she didn't need her notes. She stood on the bridge and spoke from her heart. "This bridge has no name," she began. "Most people in Millbrook have forgotten it exists. But for 63 years, someone has been sitting beneath these arches, listening to what the river has to say, recording the stories of people who pass by or pause here or throw their hopes into the water. Those stories matter. Your stories matter. Every life that touches this place leaves an imprint, adds to the collective memory that flows downstream. Tonight, we're here to celebrate that, to honor the fact that we exist, that we struggle and love and dream and persist, to witness each other. She gestured to the notebooks, which she'd arranged on a table at the bridge's entrance. These contain thousands of stories. Some of you are in here. Most of you aren't, but you could be, because everyone has a story worth telling. Tonight, I want to invite you to share yours with the group or with one other person or just with the river. Tell your story. Listen to someone else's. Let yourself be witnessed. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sarah stood up. "I'll start," she said. She walked to the center of the bridge and began to talk about her father, Robert Chun, about his quiet dedication to this place, his belief that every life mattered, his gentle way of seeing the best in people. She talked about how he'd taught her to listen, really listen, to what people weren't saying as much as what they were. When Sarah finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Then someone began to clap, and soon everyone was applauding, not for the performance of the story. It hadn't been a performance, but for the courage of the telling, for the act of vulnerability, for the gift of sharing something real. After that, the stories flowed like the river itself. People took turns standing on the bridge or sitting beneath it, telling their tales. Some stories were long and complex. Others were brief moments, single memories that had stayed with someone for years. Some made people laugh. Others brought tears. All of them mattered. Jennifer told about her breakdown and recovery, about learning to value rest and relationships over achievement. Marcus played a song he'd written about depression and the slow climb back toward light. Thomas spoke about PTSD and the healing power of water sounds. Patricia talked about her mother's dementia and the strange beauty of living in the present moment because the past kept disappearing. A teenage girl told about coming out to her parents and the mix of terror and relief she'd felt. An elderly man told about meeting his wife on this very bridge in 1954, before the highway bypass, when the bridge was still the main road through town. A woman in her 30s told about surviving cancer and how it had changed her understanding of time, making every day feel both more precious and more ordinary. The stories continued for hours. Maya tried to write them all down, but eventually she gave up and just listened. Sarah had brought a voice recorder and was capturing the audio, ensuring that this night, at least, would be preserved. As midnight approached, someone suggested a ritual. They would write their wishes or hopes or regrets on pieces of paper, fold them into origami boats, and set them afloat in the river. The current would carry them downstream, out of Millbrook, toward the distant sea. People loved this idea. Maya provided paper and pens, and soon dozens of people were bent over their boats, writing private messages meant for the river alone. Children wrote with crayons. Adults wrote with careful precision or messy scrawls. Some people wrote entire letters. Others wrote single words. When the boats were ready, they gathered at the water's edge. One by one, they released their paper vessels into the current. The boat spun slowly, some capsizing immediately, others staying upright for impressive distances. The crowd watched in silence as their hopes and fears and dreams floated away downstream, carried by the same water that had carried so many stories for so many years. Maya released her own boat last. On it she had written, "Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for teaching me to listen. Thank you for showing me that mapping hearts matters as much as mapping land." The boat caught the current and joined the others, a small fleet of paper and wishes disappearing into the darkness downstream. After midnight, the energy shifted. People settled into quieter conversation. Some curled up on blankets and dozed. Musicians played soft, improvised melodies. A few people went for night swims in the pool beneath the bridge, their splashes and laughter echoing off the stone arches. Maya sat beneath the central arch with Sarah, watching the water flow past in the lantern light. "Your father would have loved this," Maya said. Sarah nodded. "He would have. But I think he'd also say the festival isn't the important part. The important part is what happens tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. The slow, steady work of listening, of bearing witness, of recording the stories that no one else thinks matter. I'll keep doing it, Maya promised, for as long as I can. And when you can't? Sarah asked gently. Maya smiled. Then I'll leave the notebooks where someone else can find them. And maybe if we're lucky, they'll continue to work too. As dawn approached, people began to drift away. Some left in groups, still talking. Others left alone, quieter than they'd arrived. They took down the lights and lanterns, packed up the food, cleaned the space until the only evidence of the festival was trampled grass that would recover in a week. The sun rose over the eastern hills, painting the river gold and pink and orange. Maya stood at the center of the bridge and watched the last stars fade from the sky. She felt exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. The festival had been everything she'd hoped for and more, a true celebration of the human need to be seen, to be heard, to matter. But Sarah was right. The festival was just one night. The real work was the everyday practice of listening, of witnessing, of recording. That work didn't require an audience or recognition. It just required presence and attention and care. Maya climbed down from the bridge and settled into her usual spot beneath the central arch. She took out her notebook and wrote, June 21st, 2026, the summer solstice. More than 100 people gathered at the bridge to share stories and celebrate the act of witnessing each other's lives. We released paper boats carrying our wishes into the river, watched them float downstream until the current carried them out of sight. It was beautiful and communal and temporary, like all festivals, like all moments, like life itself. Tomorrow, the bridge will be quiet again, and I will be here listening. This is where we'll pause for now. Thank you for listening. Good night.